Max's breath formed little clouds in the cold air as he went over the freezing streets, his paws aching. He was hungry, his stomach, but he learned to concentrate on one thing at a time tonight from his experience of survival. Finding a secure spot to relax was his top goal as he entered an alleyway. A dumpster full of food scraps was illuminated by the dull glimmer of a street lamp, and Max cautiously walked up to his nose, twitching at the faint smell of leftovers and partially consumed sandwiches. It was enough to sustain him for. Max was unaware that another day his scavenging had not gone unnoticed, as an elderly man named Joe was wrapped in a heavy. Joe had been in the town for decades, and his coat and scarf kept watch over the dog from the shadows of his little convenience shop. I had encountered plenty of strays, but Max stood out because the dog walked with a cautious dignity, his gaze searching his surroundings as though peril lurked around every corner. Joe had a fondness for animals, particularly those who had seen adversity. Taking a leftover roast chicken from the counter of his business, went outside and whispered, "Hey buddy, are you hungry?" Max froze. His instinct was telling him to flee, but Joe's gentle tone disarming. Joe crouched, encouraged by the dog's slight head movement, pricked ears, and subtle wags from his tail, lowered and set the chicken on the ground, then moved aside to make room for Max. Gradually, Max came up to his nose. He sniffed the food, trembling, and soon he was gorging on it. Over the following few days, Way eyes will shift up to Joe every few bites in a timid. Joe started placing food outside his business at the same time every evening, and Max and the dog developed a bond. Learned to have faith in the modest, quiet man who never spoke up or moved suddenly, even though Max still. He began staying longer after meals, sitting a few feet away as Joe spoke, refusing to allow anyone touch him. One evening, Max astonished both of them by finishing his supper in a calming voice. Max sniffed as he and Joe took a tentative step closer, Joe holding his breath against the need to move. The air, his dark eyes briefly locking with Joe's, then seemingly gauging the situation. He touched Joe's outstretched hand with his nose. It was a slight action, but it signaled a change in there. Connection. Max's peaceful presence provided comfort to Joe, a widower without children. Instead, he started arranging a little blanket bed behind his store in the hopes that the dog would find refuge there. Over the course of chilly evenings, Max gradually came to appreciate Joe's care for the first. Over the years, Joe frequently felt both bodily and emotional warmth. Pondered Max's background. The physical and psychological wounds on his body spoke a tale of adversity, but Joe quietly appreciated his new friend and didn't press for love or attempt to manipulate him, but instead he showed him constant kindness, letting Max to recover at his own speed. Over the course of several months, Max's fur became more glossy and when his eyes started to shine again, he started going with Joe on his regular strolls to the town's edge where, every now and then, kids playing in the snow would wave to the two, but Max still winced at abrupt movements. As confidence gradually returned, the man-dog friendship grew stronger, based on mutual trust and understanding. Of isolation. However, on a clear spring morning, something strange occurred as Joe and Max were walking along their normal path when Max suddenly halted, staring with his nose twitching and his ears pricked up. Joe, his body tight, followed the dog's attention down the road and noticed a man approaching them. The man stared. Max's vaguely familiar tail, which had been wiggling just a moment before, became rigid. He let out a low growl in his throat, which Joe had never heard him make before. The man who was coming at them had a scruffy appearance, his clothes rumpled, and his eyes darting frantically across the street. Joe stepped out of reflex. The man's gaze fell on Max as he approached him and placed a protective hand on his head. Joe felt Max stiffen beneath his hands as he froze Max and cried out hesitantly, his voice tinged with incredulity. Contact. As the dog's growl became more intense, Joe instantly recognized the man as Max's previous owner. Max took another step forward, his hand extending as though to seize the dog. Yet he was not the same scared animal that had run away. 2 years ago, he sprang forward with a ferocious yelp, putting himself between. As dusk settled in, Joe and the stranger felt the chill of winter slicing through the barren streets of a small, rural hamlet. A lone dog, its fur matted, limped carefully down the road amid the shadows, with its eyes weighing much more than its ears. Max was a shabby mute who had suffered more in his. Max had a shorter lifespan than most animals should ever have, but as a cherished pet, he had experienced the love of a family and the gentle, a tender touch. But those recollections had vanished, to be replaced with the haunting recollections of cruelty and neglect. 2 years ago, Max's owner, Alan, was a once kind man. After losing his work and having nowhere to let his feelings out, Alan's attitude had become resentful. Alan's outbursts were mostly directed at Max, the dog, who endured harsh words, kicks, and even days without food. Max's wagging tail stopped moving, and his once bright eyes became lifeless. But in spite of the abuse, Max's spirit never completely crumbled, yet there was a glimmer of. One terrible night, following a particularly violent outburst, Max found the fortitude to flee, demonstrating his unwavering dedication and affection. He raced as quickly as his legs would allow, leaving the only house behind, with only the stinging wind at his back. For days, Max wandered aimlessly, scrounging for leftovers, as he had known him. When sleeping beneath bridges, his body's wounds conveyed a story of agony, but the spark in his eyes suggested it. With unwavering optimism, Max had no idea that his adventure was far from over. In a twist of destiny, he would meet a good-hearted stranger who would transform his life forever. But the most amazing chapter of his narrative was still to come, a moment that had been building for 2 years and would surprise everyone who had any doubts about him. Joe described what happened as police officers entered the store, their flashlights piercing the dark inside. Max sat by his side, his eyes never leaving the door, his voice steady even though adrenaline was still flowing through him. The officers promised Joe that they would patrol the area and watch for Alan, as if anticipating his return. However, their remarks didn't help him feel any less anxious. When the officers departed, Joe shut the door and crouched next to Max, petting him. He whispered softly, "The dog's head is over, buddy," but he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Max, leaning into Joe's touch, he experienced a rare moment of vulnerability the next morning, replacing his customary tiredness. He called a friend who worked at an animal shelter in a nearby town, Karen, after deciding it was time to act. Experienced animal welfare activist, and Joe knew that after hearing the incident, she would have suggestions on how to keep Max safe. Karen stated without hesitation that you must obtain a Max microchip and have it formally registered in your name. If Alan try anything, and you'll have official documentation proving Max belongs to you. Joe concurred. The process of scheduling an appointment at the shelter was simple, and Karen even volunteered to submit a report. During the interaction with Alan, a peculiar expression appeared on her face as she scanned Max's microchip to activate it. Joe inquired, his stomach clenched, and Karen paused before responding. Max has a microchip already. It was registered to Alan Thompson 2 years ago. Joe noticed a chilly knot forming in. Does that give me a legal claim to Max? He questioned, referring to his chest. Karen sighed that state-specific ownership rules differ, and in situations where, in cases of abuse or neglect, the courts nearly invariably rule in favor of the present caregiver, particularly if the animal is receiving proper care. However, this makes matters more difficult because Alan may use the news to support his argument. Made Joe uncomfortable because he had put a lot of effort into providing Max with a loving and safe environment, and the idea of Alan upsetting their lives was intolerable. But Karen's subsequent statement gave them hope. I'll get in touch with a attorney who focuses in animal custody matters. She stated that we need to ensure that Max's past is recorded in the event that there is a. Joe thanked Karen and drove Max home, feeling both relieved and anxious about the impending court struggle. Joe couldn't get rid of the notion that their problems weren't over as they sat by the fire that evening. Max. He put his head on the man's lap after noticing Joe's uneasiness, and his gentle eyes were filled with trust. Days stretched into weeks, and Joe's life gradually returned to normal. Alan Max appeared to notice the change in Joe's behavior as he avoided the spot where they had met on his daily walks with Max, mood being nearer to him and responding more quickly to their environment in spite of the stress there. Relationship kept growing until a letter showed up in Joe's mailbox one clear a.m. morning. Mailbox. The envelope was straightforward, but Joe's heart fell when he saw the return address. It was from a litigation company. He started reading the letter, which was a formal notification from Alan's attorney asserting that Max was Alan's. The letter, which demanded his return and contained numerous charges, portrayed Alan as a guy who had lost his cherished dog as a result of a number of regrettable events, and Max's maltreatment was not mentioned. Joe called Karen right away in recognition of the mental and physical wounds that revealed the whole story. The development caught everyone off guard, which is precisely why we recorded everything she said. "Don't worry, Joe. We'll fight this." Things got out of hand very fast. Alan filed a complaint, and a few days later, Joe was summoned to court. The idea of appearing before a judge to defend Max's future was intimidating, but Joe realized he had no choice when he saw the dog curled up on the rug. Max was more than a family pet. Joe sat at his kitchen table with the court summons in front of him. His thoughts whirled with feelings of fear, rage, and resolve throughout the. Max was sleeping on his bed in his room, oblivious to the legal battle that was growing all around him. Joe brushed a hand through his. "We're not going to lose this, Max," he shouted out loud as he took a long breath. "I won't allow it to happen." That night, Joe met with Karen and the attorney she suggested, more for himself than the dog. Rachel Collins was a knowledgeable and sympathetic lawyer who had experience with many animal custody situations. He promptly reassured Joe that they had a solid case, explaining that the courts give the animal's welfare top priority. "We can demonstrate abuse or neglect, so Alan won't have a chance." Rachel described their plan of action. Proof that Max's health and well-being have improved while under Joe's care, as well as statements from witnesses who could discuss Alan's handling of the dog. Karen had already compiled a list of nearby residents and shelter staff who had met Max when he was a stray, and several of them recalled his terrified manner and obvious scars across. Joe dedicated the next 3 weeks to getting ready for the case, compiling all of the pictures he had shot of Max since adopting him, demonstrating how the dog changed from a skinny, frightened stray to a strong, self-assured adult. Companion Karen assisted in locating veterinary paperwork that detailed Max's wounds and recuperation, which would be useful as important proof of his previous abuse. Even though Joe attempted to keep a sense of, Joe remained vigilant, but Max went about his daily walks as usual. Max, who was constantly looking about for Alan, seemed to sense Joe's uneasiness and would frequently stop to nuzzle his hand, or waving his tail as though to reassure him that we'll get through this one night. While Joe went over court documents in the living room, he was half expecting Alan to be there when he heard a knock at the door, and his heart raced. He discovered a young woman in her 20s standing on the opposite side, holding a stack of papers. "Hello, are you Joe?" she said. "I'm Emily, and I'm Alan's niece." Joe paused, then nodded. "What would you like?" Emily looked anxiously at the ground before looking into Joe's eyes. "I wanted to hear what she had to say about the matter. Alan is my uncle, but I know what he did to Max. Therefore, I don't deserve to help him get him back." Joe's surprise swiftly transformed into. He questioned why you would go against your own family and cautioned, "Why are you telling me this?" Emily broke down in tears, saying that Max didn't deserve to return because she had witnessed my uncle's treatment of him. Alan ignored my attempts to stop him, so when Max fled, I hoped he would discover a better life, and it appears that he did. Emily gave Joe the pile of documents. These are quotes from neighbors who saw the abuse she described, and I'm not sure if there's a video as well. Joe's hands trembled as he accepted the papers, but I felt it could help. "Thank you," he replied in a hoarse voice. "It will be enough. This means more than you can imagine," Emily said with a little smile. "Take care of." That evening, Joe and Rachel inspected him before she turned and left. The new proof, the footage from a neighbor's security camera, revealed Alan. Rachel's expression darkened as she yelled profanities and dragged Max by the collar while the dog cowered in terror. She said, "This is exactly what we needed, and it's indisputable evidence of." The court date came sooner than Joe had expected, and as he and Rachel walked into the courthouse, Joe sensed a surge. He looked down at Max, who was sitting patiently by his side, as a wave of anxiety passed over him. "We've got this, buddy," he muttered, pulling strength from the dog's serene demeanor as Joe held his leash loosely. Attitude in the courtroom. Alan was sitting with his attorney, a harsh-looking man in a snappy suit. Alan ducked out of Joe's line of sight, his face displaying a mixture of. Suddenly, the court was called by the judge, an elderly woman with a strict manner, ordered and asked Rachel to make their case. Rachel passionately described Max's journey from neglect to healing while in Joe's care. She provided the documentation, including witness veterinary documents. The video that Emily provided and the testimonials both portrayed a damning picture of Alan's abuse of the dog. Alan attempted to deflect criticism when it was his turn to speak, saying that his actions were motivated by frustration and that he had always had feelings for Max, but that the overwhelming evidence disproved his claims. His own niece's evidence, which was used against him when Emily took the stand to describe what she had observed, the judge paying close attention, and her demeanor revealed little when both. After the parties had concluded their arguments, she declared a little break before rendering her decision, and Joe sat in. Max's pulse was racing in the hallway. He couldn't take the idea of losing the dog that had become his family, but he felt a rush of hope as he saw Max's dependable eyes, since he knew he had done everything. In an effort to keep him safe, the courtroom was quiet as everyone re-entered the room to await the judge's ruling. Her conclusion: Joe's hands were on the table's edge, and his knuckles were white. In stark contrast to the tense atmosphere in the room, the judge casually adjusted her glasses at his feet. After examining the material, her voice became calm, and her demeanor was stern but inscrutable. It is evident that Mr. Alan Thompson showed signs of mistreating and neglecting the animal in. Examine Max's veterinary records, witness accounts, and video proof. I therefore declare that the circumstances this dog endured are undeniable. This court determines that Mr. Joseph Carter is Max's legitimate and entitled owner. Joe's body was saturated with no justification for Mr. Thompson's custody relief claim as he whispered, "We did it." He reached down and scratched Max behind the ears. Alan, a friend across the room, stood suddenly and slammed his hands on the table, his face twisted in anger. The judge rapped her gavel sharply, and he hissed, pointing a finger at Joe Yook. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. Alan's attorney suggested that you leave this courtroom quietly, since any more outbursts would result in contempt charges." The tension persisted even after Alan snubbed his shoulder and hurried out of the room, telling him to sit down. Rachel leaned over to Joe even after he had left, saying quietly, "We've won this battle, but be cautious, people like." Joe nodded, his happiness tempered by the lingering threat he knew Alan wouldn't let go of. Don't give up so lightly. Over the following several days, Joe made an effort to get back to his regular schedule, and he and Max started going for walks again. The court's decision gave Alan a sense of confidence this time when he ventured to explore routes further out of town, although one evening, Joe was on edge because the parting words kept repeating in his head. Saw an unfamiliar vehicle parked across the street from his store. The driver was still there. Joe's stomach rumbled as he watched the construction inside. Was it Alan, or maybe? He considered alerting the police because someone was working for him, but ultimately he chose to wait and see if the car drove away on its own ass. When darkness fell, the automobile eventually left, but Joe's uneasiness persisted. Worries with Karen, who volunteered to call the local police right away, insisting that they be informed of this. The police took Joe's report seriously and promised to increase patrols in the area because Alan is pestering you. Often, as the issue continued to weigh on him, he found himself checking his door's locks twice and examining. Max appeared to sense Joe's nervousness, and the dog had usually been on his shoulder whenever he left the store. Protective, but now that he was more alert, he positioned himself and growled at any strange noise. Nevertheless, Max's actions were consoling Joe whenever they were outside. One night when Joe was closing up, they couldn't help but fear that Alan's shadow would always be a part of their lives. The store, he heard a faint sound, a clatter of footsteps, in the alley behind the building. Max snarled low in his throat, his ears perked up, and he seized a metallic object. Flashlight, and carefully went outdoors with Max at his side. The flashlight's beam pierced the darkness, initially showing nothing, but as Joe was ready to turn around, he noticed Despite his racing heart, he yelled out steadily as a person darted behind a garbage. "Who was it?" Remained silent, but Max sprang forward, barking frantically, and Joe gripped the leash tightly. "Show yourself," he said. Very slowly, an adolescent with his hands up in front of him came out from behind the dumpster. "Give up." He appeared to be no more than 16. His face was pallid, and his clothes were filthy. "I wasn't." Joe, I swear, lowered the flashlight a little, but the boy stammered while doing anything. "Remain vigilant." "What are you doing back here?" the youngster said. He paused, and then muttered, "I was just looking for food." Joe's first mistrust was tempered by the boy's thin build and disheveled look, which conveyed suffering. "Are you homeless, Joe?" Gently questioned. The child nodded, his eyes darting anxiously toward Max, who had ceased barking but was still vigilant for Joe. "I'll grab you something to eat," as I sighed and motioned for you to come inside the store. Joe couldn't get rid of the sensation that this encounter was more than just a coincidence because the child followed him inside. Joe, was he being honest, or had Alan sent him to snoop on him? Chose to assist. So he produced a dish of food and observed the youngster gorging on it. "Thank you," the boy responded. Joe nodded, but for the time being he kept his questions to himself. His voice was hardly more than a whisper. "I didn't mean to frighten you." Couldn't deny the notion that the events of the previous few weeks had something to do with this boy's arrival. The teenager's already difficult circumstances became much more dubious as the mystery grew. Joe sat across from him, Max resting protectively at his feet. When he finished his breakfast, Joe inquired, "What's your name?" while the child fidgeted with the hem of his worn jacket and avoided looking at him. Evan muttered, attempting to calm him down, and looked up for a moment. Joe nodded before shifting his attention back to the plate. "Well, Evan, you're safe here," he said. Evan hesitated, his shoulders tensing, but he said, "You have anywhere to go, any family." He acknowledged that it was only me, but there was weight in his voice, which was almost audible. Despite his curiosity being piqued, Joe chose not to pursue a story he wasn't ready to tell. Joe gave Evan a place to stay after cleaning up, giving him the impression that Evan's unexpected visit wasn't totally random. "There is a little cot in the store's back room where you can sleep for the night and be warm." Evan nodded as he handed the youngster a blanket and said, "We can work things out tomorrow." Max followed Joe back to the main area, his tail wagging, his gratitude evident in the way he gripped the blanket. "Good boy," Joe whispered, caressing Max behind the ears, as though he could sense the boy's weakness. "Keep in." Watching him that night, Joe hardly slept, and his mind was a jumbled mix of concern and mistrust. Was Evan really just a needy, homeless adolescent, or was there? To add to his account, he remembered the strange car he had seen earlier and a persistent voice in the back of his mind. The next morning, Joe discovered Evan sitting cross-legged on the floor, whispering that Alan might still be manipulating strings. Max was laying on the floor next to him, and the dog's tail was thumping joyfully against the wood as Evan scratched behind his ears, an uncommon occurrence that made Max extremely wary. Strangers appeared very comfortable with him. "Therefore you're okay with him," Joe added, breaking the stillness. Evan gave a small smile. Joe thought it was time since the comment. "Good dog. He deserves to be treated right," weighed heavy in the air with unstated meaning. For clarification, "Evan, why were you in that alley last night?" The boy's face changed, showing a hint of remorse. "I told you, Joe," he added hastily, his face crossed. "I was hunting for food." Crossed his arms and said, "I think you needed food," in a strong but compassionate tone. He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door, but then he sighed and muttered, "Okay, but there's more to it than that." "Okay. I heard that you and Max have been talking to some individuals who claim that Alan wants the dog back. I reasoned that if I could alert you, perhaps you could assist me." Joe's heart fell, and Alan sent you no Evans. His voice was harsh with fright, and his response was instantaneous. "I would never aid him. He's a monster. I fled because I witnessed what he did to Max and other dogs. Couldn't be involved any longer." Joe looked at Evan, attempting to determine whether or not what he was saying was true. The boy's eyes were earnest. With a mixture of fear and resolve, "You collaborated with him?" Joe questioned in a low voice, and Evan nodded shamefully that he owed Alan a significant amount of money. Therefore his cheeks weren't his choice, my brother. I had no choice but to work for Alan because I couldn't pay him. Joe became enraged. Not at Evan, but at Alan. Joe inquired, "What did he make you do?" Yet his brutality appeared to know no limits. Wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Evan acknowledged that he needed to set. I tried to avoid getting into arguments, cleaning up after them, and assisting with the dogs. Depart, but Alan threatened to pursue my brother if I did. Joe's chest constricted. Evan claimed, "I just couldn't take it any longer, but I believe I was hiding in the alley because he was searching for me." Joe leaned back in his chair, wondering if Evan was. To be honest, he wasn't just a troubled young man. He could have been an ally in the battle against Alan. "You know where?" Joe inquired carefully. "Alan keeps the dogs," and Evan nodded. "Yeah, it's bad but real." Bad Joe looked at Max, who was looking at him steadily and giving him a weird sense of bravery. "Evan, I need your assistance to stop him." The boys gazed. Joe nodded with what he knew we could do. "Why stop him? You mean turn him in?" Evan hesitated, clearly afraid of what may happen if he exposed him and made sure he never again hurts a dog or person. Joe put a comforting hand on Evan's shoulder and said, "We'll be careful and watch out for him if he comes after me or you. Alan's time is running out, so we'll have the law on our side." Evan took a deep breath and then replied, "Okay, I'll help, but..." Joe nodded confidently, "Knowing that you have my word that you will protect my brother in the event of an emergency." Max sat quietly as the two started to make plans for the future, his presence serving as a constant reminder of why they were. The stakes had just gone up in the battle, and the road ahead was dangerous. Yet for the first time, Joe felt. The choice to take action against Alan signaled a sea change in the days that followed, as if they had a genuine chance at justice. Evan and Joe collaborated to create a plan. The boys' understanding of Alan's business was crucial because he understood the activities, places, and even some of the individuals who were part of the dog fighting ring. Tension lingered in the air like a thundercloud despite their efforts, Joe said. The lawyer who had outlined the circumstances and assisted him in obtaining control of Max, Rachel, listened carefully to her. Expression grim, "We can establish a solid case against Alan if Evan agrees to testify, but this is hazardous." Joe nodded. "We were ready for that, and Alan won't take this lying down. Only need to know that if things go complicated, you will have legal help, as Rachel promised him, but you must. Evan's testimony will be helpful in gathering reliable proof, but further documentation is required. Photographs or other evidence of Alan's actions." Evan raised his voice hesitantly. "Alan maintains records at the storehouse. If we can in, he resists payouts because he is anxious about his business and keeps track of everything." Joe scowled. "It's dangerous to break into his warehouse. If we're caught, we won't be Evan. We'll find what we need. I've been there 100 times, so I know the layout, and with Max we might have an advantage. Alan is unaware of your plans." Joe grudgingly consented. They decided on a nighttime date for the operation planning, and Rachel committed to working with. As the day drew near, local law enforcement made sure they would move quickly after obtaining the proof. Alan's warnings, the odd automobile outside his shop, and now this audacious idea left me feeling apprehensive. Felt as though they were traversing a precipice on a precarious rope, and Max appeared to sense his discomfort by remaining by his side. And when the Cayenne eventually showed there, Joe and Evan were dressed in dark, and they kept nudging him as though to reassure him that I had his back. Max, with his harness fastened, stood vigilantly, their actions careful and calm. The trio, accompanied by Joe, slipped out of the store and into the cold night air as they made their way to the warehouse in the moonlight. The warehouse on the outskirts of town appeared big, its shadow extending across the empty lot. Evan led the way by pointing out the security cameras and the best entry options, which are typically the back door. Joe shook his head as he muttered, "Unlocked, but be careful. Sometimes Alan leaves one of his guys here to watch the place." With their hearts racing, they made their way quietly to the rear of the building, with Max gently patted next to the door. Joe pushed it open with a small squeak, and the sound reverberated through the silence of the dimly illuminated rows within the warehouse. With cages and containers making a labyrinth of shadows, Evan gestured for Joe to follow him as he made his way through the well-known arrangement. They arrived at a tiny office nestled in a corner, its door partly open. Evan paused, then peered inside and saw it was vacant. He said, "This is where I keep the records." Joe entered and swiftly looked around the room, finding a metal filing cabinet. He leaned against the wall and asked, "Can you pick this up?" Evan nodded. As the boy worked, Joe took a tiny set of tools out of his pocket and kept an ear out for any noise. Max remained beside the door, staring at the corridor for what seemed like minutes, like hours. But at last Evan whispered in joy, understood, and unlocked the drawer displaying a wealth of records and ledgers. Joe took out his phone and started taking shots, concentrating on anything that appeared to be a list of alleged fight payments, or even pictures of. Joe froze his hand halfway to another dog when Max let out a low growl. "Stack of papers. What's it, boy?" he said as he moved for the door. Joe's heart was racing as the distant echo became louder by the second. "Evan, we have company." Evan shoved the documents back into the drawer and quickly locked it. "We must leave," he whispered in a quivering voice. Joe agreed, walking to. Max kept his ears tight as they made their way swiftly, but silently, through the maze of crates on their way out of the workplace. As they got closer to the exit, a flashlight beam raced over the room, missing them by inches, and he was alert and agitated. Joe gestured for Evan to listen after hearing a rough voice shout out, "Someone's here." Keep low as the voices got closer and closer as they slipped toward the back entrance. Max snarled once more, his body low to the ground, suspiciously, and just as they got to the door, someone shouted, "Hey!" Joe stopped, pushed the door wide, and they ran into the night, Max leading the way. They heard footsteps behind them. As irate voices flooded the air, they ran across the parking lot, their heart pounding as they fled by the. Their hearts were pounding and their breaths were labored by the time they arrived to the safety of Joe's truck. "Did you get the?" Evan questioned in a trembling voice, and Joe nodded while holding up his phone. Joe looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that they had everything we needed as they drove back to the shop. With headlights pursuing them, the threat was still present, but for the first time, they were in control of the evidence. Alan's plan came tumbling down when they gathered enough, and the truck rocked over the uneven road as the thrill from their escape still pumped through their veins as Joe and Evans drove out of the warehouse. Max was splayed over the back seat, his chest rising and falling regularly as their minds raced and their breath was thin, periodically checking the rearview mirror with alert eyes as though he too detected. Joe broke the quiet first because of the seriousness of the situation, "And you were brave in return. I couldn't have done it without you, Evan," he remarked in a sincere tone. Though his hands were still shaking, he managed a small smile. "I couldn't stop thinking about all the dogs Alan had injured." Joe nodded, tightening his hold on the stick steering wheel. "If this helps stop him, it's worth it. We've had enough to permanently close him down." As they got closer to the store, Joe's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and it was Rachel. Joe inquired anxiously whether she had gotten what she needed, and Joe said that he had. Despite his nervousness, his voice remains firm, and we have enough pictures of his records to demonstrate that he is operating an unlawful business. When I return, I'll mail them to you." Rachel exhaled in relief. "Good, I'll begin working on a case file right away. But Joe, you must be cautious of Alan. When he learns of your actions, he will not think twice about taking revenge." Joe looked at Evan, who was lost in thought as he stared out the window. After Joe ended the call, "I knew we would keep quiet for the time being." The shop's driveway and turned off the engine. The darkness fell over them in sharp contrast to the commotion they'd. Joe quickly left the house and put up his laptop to publish the pictures while Evan busied himself feeding Max the dog, who happily wagged his tail. His manner served as a pleasant reminder of their sharing mission. Joe couldn't help but notice the tension as the pictures moved. Evan shrugged when he stated, "You did great tonight," in his posture. His face is reserved, but I hope it's enough, Alan. He's not the type of person who quits up lightly. Joe put it comforting. Putting a hand on the boy's shoulder is sufficient, and we'll be prepared if he approaches us. Joe couldn't sleep that night despite every creak in the store and every wind rustle. He couldn't get rid of the impression that Alan was already preparing his next move after he sensed Joe's. He remained uneasy, putting his head on Joe's lap while they waited in the darkened room. The following morning, the proof was handed to Rachel, who called the police right away, and they're looking into it. She then told Joe if everything. It was a relief to hear that they will raid Alan's operation within the week, but it also brought new challenges. Joe was aware that they remained under danger until Alan was taken into arrest. Decided not to risk the youngster being discovered alone as the days went by, and to keep Evan in the shop for the time being. A bond between Joe and Evan developed as they cooperated to take care of Max and Keep. Joe discovered more about how the shop's common goal strengthened their relationship beyond each party's expectations. Evan's previous aspirations to become a veterinarian stemmed from his love of animals. As they were cleaning the store one evening, Joe remarked, "You make a great vet." Alan's shadow had fallen over his existence. Evan grinned for the first time in days, a ray of hope shining on his face. "Perhaps one day if we get," Joe nodded, saying, "We will, and you'll have a fresh start when we do." The Dogon, who had previously been wary of strangers, suddenly followed Evan when Max appeared to accept him into his pack. Max's bond with his eager tail wagging around the store was evidence of his tenacity and remembering that one afternoon, as they were out back fixing a fence, they all fought for a second chance. When the automobile entered the driveway, Joe automatically stiffened his hand and moved it toward the. Rachel had a wrench in his toolbox, but her face was a mixture of urgency and, she said as she got out of her car, determination. "The authorities are moving in tonight." After reviewing the evidence and obtaining a warrant, Alan's operation is coming to an end. Joe looked at. When Joe asked Rachel, Evan gulped hard. Did he know that she hesitated? "However, you should be extremely vigilant since Alan can lash out if he suspects anything." Joe double-checked the shop's locks in the evening as the sun sank beyond the horizon, keeping Max close while Evan paced. His energy was restless and tense, and every shadow outside the windows seemed like a possible threat. The raid was a success when Joe's phone buzzed with a text from Rachel a few hours later. Joe exhaled, unaware that he was keeping it in, and remarked, "Alan is in custody," displaying the message to Evan. The boy's shoulders dropped in relief, and he grinned broadly for the first time in weeks. Max gave a quiet bark. Joe knelt next to him, scratching behind his ears as though sensing the wind. "We did it, buddy, and you're safe now." Yet as Joe, he couldn't get rid of the notion that their journey wasn't quite ended as he gazed into the night. Alan might be behind prison, but the wounds he had caused to Max, Evan, and innumerable others would require time to recover. But Joe was committed to supporting them at every stage. The resulting relief. Although the immediate threat appeared to have passed after Alan's brief detention, Joe was still affected by the wounds he caused. Had hoped that their ordeal would end with the arrest, but the days that followed presented unforeseen difficulties that put their commitment to the test. Word of Alan's capture went swiftly around the community, and although most people rejoiced over the takedown, others weren't as happy with Alan's associates' men because they were infamous criminals, had profited from his illicit activities, started to stir, and whispers of reprisal made their way to Joe. One evening, when Joe and Evan were out, worried neighbors and customers overheard talks in nearby taverns. A truck with long, frightening headlights sat suspiciously at the end of the driveway, closing up the business. The air was chilled by the shadows and the hum of its engine, and Vigilance stood alert with a low growl. Joe stepped outdoors with his heart thumping and his throat churning. "Could I help?" The truck driver didn't answer right away when he called, his voice firm despite the uneasiness that was beginning to seep into his chest. Rather, the engine roared and the car edged closer before accelerating into the night with a tire screech. Evan showed up at the door with a pale face, leaving a trail of dust behind him. Joe shook his head as he asked, "I don't know, but we need to be careful." The peculiar vehicle started to emerge around the shop at peculiar hours, and the incident signaled the start of a fresh wave of worry. Despite the fact that the authorities had dismantled Alan's, Joe began to see strange people hanging around town. Operation, it was evident that some of his network's surviving members were not pleased with. Joe was advised by the voice of reason to notify the authorities about the incidents after they lost their leader, Rachel. "Need to know what's going on." She insisted that it's unlawful, even if it's only intimidation. Joe heeded her advice, but with Alan behind bars, The authorities thought the matter was under control, but the response was less than comforting. The police stated that it wasn't the assurance Joe had, so keep an eye out and notify us if something significant occurs. Hoped for, but as the days stretched into weeks, the stress affected everyone, causing Evans's anxiousness to return, and he stopped going outside unless it was absolutely essential, and Max noticed that the household was becoming increasingly uneasy, protecting Joe and Evan at all times. But one evening, when the argument reached a breaking point, Max's frenzied barking woke Joe. Evan showed there a few moments after he bolted upright, his heart pounding, grabbed a flashlight, and made his way to the rear door. He asked, his eyes wide with horror, "What's going on?" Before Joe could respond, someone had thrown a brick through one of the windows, and the faint sound of glass breaking reverberated throughout the store. Joe knew his stomach was sinking and called 911 as the flare of fire flickered in its path, attempting to burn us out. Max had already arrived at the smashed window, snarling ferociously at the fire extinguisher as Evan hurried to get it. Joe doubted the flames quickly, but the damage was done and the message was obvious as the figures fled into the darkness. Authorities discovered minimal proof of the perpetrators when they arrived, and the incident was formally classified as vandalism, but Joe understood it to be more than that. It was a reminder that the risk had not been eliminated by Alan's arrest. Joe found it difficult to console Evan, who was clearly shaken. Through this, he pledged, but the words fell hollow as Hollow Max drew close to Evan, his presence providing a. Rachel brought important news the next day, which provided a little amount of consolation. Her attitude is grim as Alan tries to make a deal by mentioning names, but it's stirring. Joe became irate because some of the people he's accusing are dangerous, so we're still not safe. Not yet, Rachel acknowledged, but his evidence has the potential to destroy the whole network. We simply need to wait a little while longer to learn that Alan's associates were being pursued by the law. Although enforcement provided some solace, it also raised the stakes, and Joe realized they couldn't afford any more near misses. Joe started reinforcing the store because he was determined to take charge of the situation and put Evan's safety at risk. He strengthened the windows and doors, put security cameras, and closely monitored the neighborhood where Max stayed. Constant vigilance and unshakable loyalty. In spite of the safety measures, Joe knew they couldn't continue to live in dread. So he started contacting people in the neighborhood to build support for more stringent laws against. The tale of Max's rescue and the struggle against Alan's network struck a chord with those who were concerned about animal abuse and unlawful activity, many igniting a surge of activism that offered some optimism. But the battle wasn't finished yet, and Joe and Evan prepared for Alan's trial as the days drew near. They knew the path ahead would be challenging, but they also understood they could prepare themselves for whatever might come next. Weren't by themselves. With Max at their side, they got ready for the last chapter of their journey. The anxiety in Joe's life peaked as the silent trial date for Alan drew near. Every moment felt like the calm before, and the life he had constructed around his rescue store seemed to be hanging by a thread. Evan attempted to concentrate on helping out around the shop despite the approaching storm, but his constant looks at the windows and doors revealed Max's uneasiness, and Vigilance seemed to feel the same fatigue, frequently snarling at noises. "Joe, I just learned that Ellen's associates are going to change everything. Rachel called me that evening with an update, preparing anything significant. They're desperate, and they may be aiming to communicate with you," to convey Joe's hold on the phone. Tighter. "Do we know the exact time or method yet?" Rachel acknowledged. Her voice was laced with fury, but I reported it to the police because they're on guard. Joe hung up, his mind racing. It wasn't just about him anymore. Max and Evan's safety hinged on his next action. He made the proactive decision to better safeguard the store and provide Evan with an emergency plan in case. Joe firmly stated that you should take Max and go to the shelter by the woods, which is hidden and impossible for them to find. Evan nodded there, but his expression showed anxiety. "How about you?" "I'll handle whatever comes," Joe said, his face displaying determination. When the confrontation eventually occurred the following evening, Joe was startled awake by the noise. He looked through the blinds to see 3 trucks entering the driveway with their headlights on after hearing the sound of automobile engines outside. Shadows rushed swiftly, penetrating the darkness, as other men emerged. their intents evident. Joe didn't wait. He took out his phone, dialed Rachel, and spoke in a low, frantic voice. "There. I'm sending the police here," Rachel said sharply. "Don't engage them." Joe hung up and turned away. Joe pushed Evan, who was already holding Max's leash, to let go, but Evan paused for a split second before running out the back door with Max in tow and vanishing into the darkness that Joe had locked the door behind them and prepared himself for what was about to happen as the men, their footsteps crunching, approached the store. One of them, a burly figure with a scar along his cheek, beat on the door against the gravel. "We know you're." Joe's heart was racing when he called out to him to have a conversation, but he forced. He called the police back and said, "Stay calm, you're trespassing." The scarred man laughed. "We're not going to stay that long, but we thought we'd remind you of what occurs." A low, frightening sound. When you put your nose in the wrong place. One of the men shattered a window with another started hammering at the reinforced door, while the crowbar sent glass fragments flying across the floor. Joe tested its strength by withdrawing farther inside the store, his thoughts racing for an answer. Max, who was cowering in the shelter with Evan, gave a low growl as though he could sense danger. Evan, facing his owner, clung to him while whispering, "Stay calm, Max." Joe made the quick decision to get a flare gun from his emergency supplies and discharge it because he was banking on us back at the store. Joe lost valuable seconds as the intruders were frightened by the brilliant light and loud commotion coming through the shattered window. Took out his phone and called Rachel once more. "They're breaking in," he said, panting. "How far are the police?" Rachel told him to wait a little while longer because they are close. The intruders regained their composure and renewed their. With a grin, the scarred man kicked down the broken door and entered with Joe, but Joe wasn't. Max had escaped Evan's grasp by himself and hurried back to the store, his senses driving him in the direction of the danger. The dog barked fiercely and rushed through the side entrance, briefly stopping the guys in. Fearing for the dog's safety, Max no Joe yelled in their tracks, but Max wasn't. Fearful, he sprang at the closest intruder, slamming him to the ground with his strong body. The chaos diverted just long enough for the air to be filled with the sound of approaching sirens. The scarred man swore, directing his troops to flee. "This isn't done," he growled and gave Joe a fierce look before vanishing into. When the police came that evening, officers swiftly secured the area as their flashing lights illuminated the commotion area and started collecting statements. Rachel soon followed, her face displaying a mixture of. She hugged Joe hard and added, "You're lucky to be alive. I owe Max my life because I looked at him while he was being examined by an officer." Softly, Joe recognized that the encounter had simply made him more determined as the adrenaline wore off. Allen's. With Rachel's assistance, associates may have been forced to leave for the time being, but their struggle was far from done. Joe promised to see the matter through to the end, making sure that justice was done for everyone, not just himself. Every victim of Allen's brutality had been shaken by the encounter, but Joe's determination remained unyielding. The assault on. As dawn came over the peaceful town of Joe, his business was more than simply an attempt to intimidate. It was a declaration of war. Realized that the fight was no longer just about him, but also about standing up for what he believed in and safeguarding all he loved. The police inquiry started right away in an effort to break the cycle of cruelty and fear that Allen's associates maintained. Officers searched the shop's debris for evidence and pieced together what had happened before. Joe gave all the information he could that night, and Rachel used her contacts to intensify the case. "We now have sufficient evidence to file charges against additional Allen's network members," she stated resolutely. Joe wasn't satisfied, but "We'll finish what we started this time," lighting her eyes. He had discovered via this experience that occasionally taking action was required to quietly wait for justice. Over the following few days, he devoted himself to fortifying the defenses of those who were unable to defend themselves. Shop's defenses by enlisting the help of the community and strengthening his relationship with Max, whose unrelenting bravery had saved his life. Max appeared to notice that Joe's perspective had changed. The dog. At night, he lay at the foot of Joe's bed, his keen eyes searching for any indications of danger. Evan, whose ears twitched at the slightest sound, also found comfort in Max's company. Despite being severely upset by the incident, he started to find strength in the dog's unwavering devotion, and suddenly he made a breakthrough. Rachel called to inform her that Alan had finally consented to provide law police with complete cooperation in exchange for a shortened sentence. He divulged vital details about his network, such as the whereabouts of stashes and safe places. "There are enough incriminating documents to bring down the entire operation," Rachel remarked in a voice. A wave of relief washed over triumphant Joe, but it was tempered by prudence. Regarding his associates who attacked us, Rachel acknowledged that they were on the run, but based on Alan's statement, "We'll eventually locate them." But that moment arrived earlier than anticipated one evening, while Joe was shutting up the "We found them" shop. Rachel contacted again, and she stated that a task force is coming in. Joe hung up, his heart heavy with expectation, knowing that tonight was the last one. This chapter would come to an end with the raid, but the wounds from the previous weeks would not go away quickly. He looked down at, "We accomplished it," pal Joe replied, with Max waving his tail in silent approval. "We arrived quietly, but police officers attacked the scene with swift and immediate action. Without incident, Hideout arrested Alan's associates, and the operation destroyed the final traces of the network, making sure that nobody else would be harmed by their brutality." When Rachel contacted to inform Joe of the situation, Joe felt it. She said, "You're safe now, but it feels like it's really over." Joe was aware that the true triumph lay not only in their survival, but also in the lives they had spared, both human and animal. In the weeks that followed, the town came together to support Joe and his store, turning it into as a testament to tenacity and kindness. Volunteers donated their time and money to help repair the damage. Evan also started to recover with Max by his side in order to help with the rescues. Found the strength to go outside once more, and his terror was replaced by a calm resolve that they sought to broaden the shop's scope by establishing a shelter where no animal would ever have to experience the atrocities Max had. On a bright afternoon, Joe and Evan watched a bunch of kids play with Max in the yard outside the store. For the first time in weeks, Joe felt a profound feeling of peace as laughing filled the room. "We did it," he said, looking at Evan, who nodded. "We transformed a bad situation into a positive one." "Max did it and claimed to have saved us," Joe, with a little smile on his face, observed Max, who was now laying in the grass with his eyes half closed in satisfaction because the dog had endured so much. But when Joe learned that Max wasn't, his spirit stayed intact. As the sun sank below the horizon, he was a hero, just a survivor. Joe knelt next to Max in the warm golden glow and scratched behind his ears. He said, "You're a good boy, Max," in an emotionally charged voice. "You're the best, Max," was a silent, unsaid bond who waggled his tail and had loyalty in his eyes. In the weeks after the raid, they felt rejuvenated and resolved to tackle whatever was ahead together. The wounds from the altercation were still visible, but they acted as a reminder of Joe's courage and purpose in life. The shop became a beacon of hope because of the community's continuous support, which he and those around him had discovered. The store, now affectionately known as Max's Haven, was a location where second chances weren't just granted, they were cherished. Became a local landmark, drawing visitors from neighboring cities and towns who came to hear the amazing tale of Max's tenacity and bravery. Max, the once mistreated dog, become a representation of bravery and devotion, and his tale has motivated innumerable individuals to oppose animal abuse. Every morning, Max would go for walks with Joe, strengthening their relationship in ways Joe never imagined. The property, his tail bouncing excitedly, the previously nervous dog now radiated happiness and confidence. Everyone who visited Evan was made to smile by his amusing antics, and Max's presence was therapeutic. Once too scared to trust the world, the young kid now worked tirelessly with Joe to take care of the one afternoon, interacting with animals and welcoming guests with a renewed sense of purpose. Rachel went inside the store, and her smile showed how proud she was of what they had managed to do. "You've changed this place into something incredible," she remarked, observing the flurry of activity around her. A new family departed with a rescued puppy, Volunteers cleaned the cages, and kids played with the animals. Joe's gaze followed Max as he nodded, their faces glimmering with joy. Max taught us what it is to fight for what we believe in, he remarked as a group of kids ran through the yard. Rachel's face softened because you gave him that chance, Joe, and now look at all the lives that have been saved. He was moved as they spoke, and we heard Max's story when a mother with her daughter came up clutching a donation envelope. She said, her voice shaking with passion, "Thank you for what gave us the courage to leave a bad situation. You're doing this here." Joe took the envelope, feeling humbled by what the woman said. These kinds of events served as a reminder to him of the reason he had embarked on this mission to establish a safe haven for those in need. In the meantime, their activities had a significant impact outside of the store. Several animal trafficking rings were dismantled as a result of Alan's testimony, and new legislation was developed to improve safeguards against cruelty, and Rachel is now a leading proponent of these. During public hearings, Max's story was frequently discussed and used as a call to action for justice. But for Joe, on a calm evening, as the sun sank over the horizon, the real prize was nearer to home. Evan was by his side, and Max was at his feet as he sat on the porch. A soft breeze carried the laughing of kids playing nearby as the yard was filled with bright light. Of peace serves as a reminder that light can triumph even in the midst of darkness. The silence was broken by Evan's voice. "Do you think Max remembers everything?" For example, Joe looked down at Max, who stared back at him with. Joe responded seriously, "I believe he trusts sight, but I also think he selects. Must concentrate on what he has now that he is a survivor, Evan, and remember that survivors." As they grew, Evan reached out to pat Max and nodded as if he understood. Evan murmured softly, "I want to be like him," and he responded by waving his tail. Joe grinned and ruffled the boy's hair, saying, "You're already as strong as nightfall." Kept in mind that day, a silent confirmation that they were headed in the right direction, even though the trip hadn't been simple, and although there were still obstacles to overcome, they would do so with Max at the forefront. Max was sitting by the door with his leash in his mouth when Joe woke up in the morning. Joe laughed, grabbed the leash, and opened the door as the dog's eyes glistened with anticipation, perhaps asking what would happen next. As they entered the crisp morning air, Joe experienced a renewed feeling of purpose. "Let's find out, buddy." Max had been. He had given Joe and everyone else a reason to trust in the power of hope by giving them a second opportunity. Did Max's story inspire you with its unwavering love and tenacity? What do you think? Animals demonstrate their devotion and affection. Tell us what you think in the comment section below, and if you want to see more articles like this, remember to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's make the see you in the future video. The world is a better place for animals and their humans.